You step one more inch onto my grass, and I'll have you locked up for trespassing." That was a scream that shattered my Sunday morning peace as Karen marched across her perfectly edged lawn in leopard print slippers and a silk robe, armed with a phone in one hand and a trembling cup of coffee in the other. I froze mid-snip, hedge trimmers dangling from one hand, confused by the sudden hurricane of entitlement blowing my way. I wasn't on her lawn. In fact, I was trimming a bush that had stood in the exact same spot on the border of my property since before she even bought that house. But to Karen, facts didn't matter. All that mattered was control, and today, apparently, I was her target. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I'd planned to clean up the edge of my property, drink some lemonade, maybe throw a steak on the grill later. Instead, I found myself standing face to face with a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days, but had somehow summoned enough energy to organize a neighborhood war tribunal over a misplaced blade of grass. She kept tapping her phone screen, probably trying to get through to the HOA's emergency line. Her finger was trembling with rage. Her bathrobe belt flapped in the wind like she was about to duel me at dawn. The worst part? I was still holding the trimmers like some kind of clueless suburban pirate. I tried reasoning with her. I calmly explained that I was on my property, that the bush had been here long before her house even existed, and that the property line ran just a few feet from her driveway. She wasn't hearing any of it. Instead, she pulled a yellowed paper out of her pocket that she called her HOA covenant. She waved it like it was a royal decree and pointed to a highlighted section. "I have landscaping authority on all visible edges of the street-facing portion of adjacent lots." I didn't even know what that meant, and I'm pretty sure she didn't either. But she said it with the confidence of someone who thinks yelling louder makes you more right. Then came the golf cart, rolling down the street with a flashing orange light and a slow beep-beep, like it was some kind of emergency vehicle. Driving it was Frank, the HOA president, and conveniently, Karen's cousin. He pulled up like he was about to oversee a hostage negotiation and stepped out holding a clipboard that had seen way too many fines and not enough real paperwork. Karen started clapping like a child at a puppet show. "There! That's him. That's the trespasser," she shrieked, pointing at me. Frank adjusted his sunglasses, looked at my hedge trimmers, and nodded like he just solved a crime. Frank told me I was in clear violation of community boundary expectations and that I'd be receiving a formal letter of censure. I asked him if he could show me exactly where the property line was. He looked at Karen. She looked at him. Then he pointed vaguely at the bush and said, "It's somewhere right here, but you should know, if you don't comply, the HOA has the right to escalate this." That's when I knew this was going to be more than just a Sunday argument. This was war, and I don't lose wars. Before I could respond, a black and white sheriff's cruiser rolled up. Apparently, Karen had actually called the real cops on me. The deputy got out, already rubbing his temples, as if he knew what kind of nonsense he was walking into. He asked what the issue was. Karen launched into a tirade about how I was aggressively trimming vegetation and violating visual harmony with rogue shrubbery. Yes, those were her actual words. The deputy turned to me, trying to keep a straight face, and asked for my ID. I handed it over along with my property deed that I kept in my garage for situations just like this. Believe it or not, this wasn't Karen's first outburst. After a brief walk around the edge of the lawn and a few muttered uh-huhs, the deputy handed me back my paperwork and said I was within my rights. Karen nearly choked on her coffee. She stormed back to her porch, shouting that this wasn't over, that I'd hear from the legal department, and that she would be escalating this all the way to the city council. Frank nodded solemnly, like they were about to file a declaration with the UN. I figured that was the end of it, but something about the way Karen looked at the edge of her property, like she was unsure, just for a split second, planted a seed in my mind. What if she was wrong? What if the reason she was so loud, so aggressive, was because she was trying to cover up a mistake she didn't want discovered? I walked back to my shed and pulled out an old, dusty file box my grandfather had left behind. Inside was a rolled-up map, faded and brittle from the 1980s. It showed the original property lines, before the neighborhood had been subdivided and before the HOA even existed. And that's when I noticed something strange. Karen's house wasn't just near my lot line. It was partially on it. I squinted, lining up the map with the satellite image on my phone, then walked back out to the bush. I stuck a metal rod into the ground where the old boundary post used to be. Then I walked 100 feet west, the exact distance noted on the map, and placed a second rod. That line ran straight through Karen's front porch. My heart started pounding. Not out of fear, but out of the cold, calculating thrill of uncovering a truth someone else didn't want found. If I was right, this wasn't about a hedge. This was about a house built partially on land that didn't belong to her. And if that was true, then the real trespasser wasn't me. I took a deep breath, walked back inside, and called a licensed surveyor. It was time to redraw the lines. Literally. Karen wanted to play HOA games? Fine. But she didn't realize she just challenged someone who plays for keeps. The survey team arrived on a clear Wednesday morning, pulling up in a white pickup with their company logo painted across the door and tripod strapped to the roof. Karen was already outside, watering her driveway for reasons unknown to science, wearing oversized sunglasses and a visor like she was prepping for battle at a country club. The moment she saw the crew unloading equipment, she stormed toward them with a righteous fury that could only come from someone both entirely wrong and completely convinced of their moral superiority. One of the surveyors, a tall man named Dave, stepped forward and calmly greeted her. "Morning, ma'am. We're here to conduct a property boundary survey. Just routine, nothing invasive." Karen didn't even let him finish before she threw her garden hose at his boots and shrieked, "This is private property. You can't be here without HOA permission." I stepped out of my garage at that moment, sipping on my coffee and holding the land deed in one hand and a copy of the county's survey request permit in the other. Actually, they're on my land, and I invited them. Karen's jaw dropped. For a few seconds, she looked like a puppet with its strings cut. Then, like a glitching robot, she rebooted into a new form of rage. "This is harassment," she screeched. "You're trying to intimidate me. I'm calling the HOA board right now." She ran inside, leaving behind a trail of wet footprints and a lingering smell of overwatered ego. Dave and his team got to work, carefully mapping coordinates and marking distances using GPS equipment and old survey pins buried in the ground. I stood nearby silently, watching, arms crossed. Every so often one of the surveyors would whistle low under their breath or raise an eyebrow as they reviewed the original land plat. What started as a simple confirmation soon turned into something more complicated. I could see them huddling around a set of documents on the tailgate of their truck, pointing at measurements and using a long metal rod to probe the soil for buried boundary markers. After about an hour, Dave walked over, scratching his beard. "You might want to come take a look at this," he said. I followed him back to the truck. There, on the paper, were several red flags, literally and figuratively. According to the measurements, my property line extended a good 15 feet past the bush Karen had accused me of trimming, cutting diagonally through what she had claimed was her lawn. But that wasn't the shocking part. The real surprise came when Dave continued tracing the line, right through Karen's flower beds, across her porch, and directly into the corner of her actual living room. Her house was sitting on my land, not by inches, by feet. I had to blink several times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. How is this even possible? I asked. Dave shrugged. Best guess? Bad subdivision records or a faulty build. Could have been overlooked during construction. This happened sometimes in older neighborhoods that were converted into HOA communities after they were built. It made sense, but it still felt unreal. Karen's entire smug existence was about to come crashing down, and she had no idea. I could already hear her voice in my head, yelling about her castle and her rights. Except now, she didn't have a legal leg to stand on. As the survey team began placing orange flags into the ground to mark the true boundary, Karen reemerged from her house like a villain in a soap opera returning from commercial break. She had her phone camera recording this time. "I am documenting this illegal activity," she shouted. "You're all going to jail." She marched right up to one of the flags and yanked it from the soil like she was pulling a sword from a stone. "This is my property," she declared. But the flag snapped at the base, and her victory gesture ended with her tripping backward into a flower pot. The camera, still recording, caught the whole thing. I watched as one of the surveyors discreetly smirked. Karen scrambled to her feet, dirt on her knees, still clutching the broken flag like it proved something. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The flag said it all. The red, orange, and white plastic streamers fluttered across her yard like party decorations for a birthday she wasn't invited to. Later that afternoon, Dave handed me the preliminary report along with a flash drive containing GPS data and photos of every marker they'd found. "You've got a strong case," he said. "This isn't just a boundary error. This is a title issue. Her house is partially on land you legally own. If you push this, you could technically claim part of her structure." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. "Thanks, Dave. This might be the beginning of something big." Karen, meanwhile, was pacing her porch like a general surveying a battlefield. She was on speakerphone with someone, I assumed her cousin Frank, ranting about survey fraud, boundary scams, and something about deep fake deeds. I could hear her clearly from where I stood. "He forged everything, I just know it. And I want the HOA legal team to file a motion or lawsuit or injunction, whatever it takes." She paused. "No, I don't care what the survey says. It's my grass." I went back into my house, pulled out the old plat map my grandfather had drawn by hand in 1982, and laid it next to the new GPS report. The two lined up perfectly. There was no mistake. The ground I was standing on, and the land Karen had turned into her own personal fief, belonged to me, and had for decades. She just built a house on it like no one would ever question it. It was a surreal realization. All this time, I'd been treating her as an annoyance, a mosquito buzzing near the fence. But now I realized she wasn't just a loud neighbor. She was a squatter, living partly on land she didn't own. And instead of checking her facts, she called the police, the HOA, and filmed videos claiming I was a problem. I knew it was time to take the next step. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore. This was going to court. I printed out everything. The survey report, historical plat, my deed, and even screenshots of Karen's social media videos. She had posted 3 that day alone, ranting about illegal flag plants and deep state landscapers. They were laughable, but they helped my case more than she knew. I sat down, looked out the window at the flags cutting across her perfect lawn, and smiled. For the first time, Karen's noise wasn't just background chaos. It was a drumbeat of her own unraveling. And the best part? I hadn't even played my best card yet. That would come next, when the law stepped in the next morning. I found an envelope taped to my front door. It had the HOA's logo printed on the corner, and a red urgent stamp right over the seal, as if they thought that would make it more intimidating. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I walked out to the edge of my lawn, where the neon orange flags still danced across the grass, marking the awkward truth that Karen's house wasn't just close to the line. It was on the wrong side of it. She was out there, too, watering the same spot for the 3rd time that week, as if overhydrating her roses would somehow make the flags disappear. She didn't look up at me, but I could feel the tension clinging to the air like humidity before a storm. When I finally opened the letter, it was every bit as ridiculous as I expected. The HOA claimed that I had willfully disturbed the visual harmony of the neighborhood, engaged in aggressive property surveying, and intimidated fellow residents through hostile markers and psychological landscaping. I read it twice just to make sure it wasn't satire. Then I laughed, because included with the notice was a fine, $500 for non-approved boundary disturbances. That was rich. The HOA was trying to fine me for proving I owned the land Karen had built her porch on. I placed the letter on the kitchen counter, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and made a call to my lawyer. His name was Preston, and he had the calm, tired voice of someone who'd spent too many years dealing with neighborhood drama. After explaining the situation and sending over the documents and survey, there was a long pause. Then he said, "Well, you're not just in the right, you're in the driver's seat. This could be a full title action if you wanted to be." I asked him what that meant, and he explained that I could file a quiet title lawsuit, basically a legal way of confirming ownership and clearing any dispute. "If her house is on your land," he said, You can either negotiate a sale, lease it to her, or even force a removal. It's up to you. The idea of evicting Karen from her own house felt extreme. But after weeks of harassment, threats, and social media tantrums, I wasn't feeling particularly generous. Still, I decided to play it smart. I told Preston to prepare the documents, but to hold off on filing until I'd made one final offer to settle this civilly. Part of me hoped she'd see reason. The other part knew better. Meanwhile, Karen was doubling down. She'd organized a community emergency meeting in the HOA clubhouse. I received a hand-delivered invitation, another red-stamped envelope, though this one had a photocopied image of my face next to a caption that read "Property Predator" in bold letters. I showed it to Preston, who nearly spit out his coffee. "Good," he said. "She's documenting her own defamation case now, too." I decided to attend the meeting just to see what kind of circus I was up against. The clubhouse was packed with concerned neighbors, most of them sitting quietly, unsure why they were even there. Karen stood at the front with a slideshow presentation that looked like it had been made in 1998. She clicked through blurry screenshots of the survey flags, labeled them invasion markers, and showed zoomed-in pictures of me holding a clipboard, as if that alone proved I was part of some shady land-snatching cartel. "He's not one of us," she declared. "He's trying to break our HOA from the inside and take over our land." A few people clapped, but most looked deeply uncomfortable. When she finally gave me a chance to speak, I kept it short. I simply pulled out the official land survey, laid it on the table, and pointed to the exact line where her house crossed into my property. Then I pulled out a copy of my grandfather's deed and showed that my family had owned this land since 1982. "I'm not trying to steal anything," I said. "I'm just defending what was already mine. If anyone here had this happen to them, I imagine you'd do the same." The room went silent. Karen's face turned color tomato paste, and for the first time in weeks, she had no words. She just stood there blinking, trapped in her own. The next day, Preston and I sent an official notice to Karen and the HOA board. It explained that her property was encroaching, that legal action was pending, and that she had two options: purchase the sliver of land her house rested on, or sign a lease agreement to rent it from me. We even offered a below-market rate if she agreed to stop her harassment and retract the false claims she'd made publicly. For any reasonable person, it was a lifeline, but Karen wasn't reasonable. 2 days later, she filmed herself ripping the notice into tiny pieces, screaming that no one blackmails Karen into paying rent for her own house. The video went viral, though not for the reason she wanted. The comments were brutal. People called her delusional, arrogant, and even asked if she'd ever heard of a land survey before. One guy wrote, "You're yelling at the guy who legally owns your porch. Maybe try cookies next time instead of court threats." I watched the video 3 times, not for satisfaction, but to remind myself just how far she was willing to push this. Meanwhile, Preston had filed the quiet title suit. It would take time, but we had everything we needed: deeds, survey documentation, video evidence of her admitting to knowing about the boundary dispute and ignoring it. Karen's refusal to negotiate or settle would only hurt her more when the judge saw her behavior. And once that process was done, I'd have the court's full backing that the land and the portion of her home on it was mine. By the end of the week, the mood in the neighborhood had shifted. I noticed fewer people waving to Karen and more people waving to me. Some neighbors even stopped by quietly to ask what was really going on. When I showed them the flags and the documents, most just shook their heads and said, "Figures." Apparently, I wasn't the first person Karen had targeted, just the first one who fought back. One evening, as the sun set over the neatly trimmed roofs of our little suburb, I stood near the edge of my lawn and looked out across the invisible line that had caused so much chaos. The flags were still up, bright and undeniable. Karen's porch light flicked on, casting a long shadow that stopped exactly where my property began. I smiled to myself, not out of spite, but out of the simple, quiet knowledge that truth, however buried, always has a way of coming to the surface. And in Karen's case, it had come up waving orange plastic ribbons and a notarized seal. A week after the lawsuit was filed, Karen received a formal letter from the county. It was stapled to her door, with a bright orange tag flapping underneath, signaling urgent zoning review required. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a moment the tide turned completely. Karen, who had spent the past few weeks marching up and down the block warning neighbors about the madman trying to steal her land, now stood frozen on her own front porch, staring at a government seal she couldn't scream over. She yanked it off and stormed inside. But the damage was done. Word spread fast. The letter stated that her property had been flagged for zoning violation due to structural encroachment, and if the dispute was resolved legally within 30 days, her home could be designated partially non-compliant, making it virtually unsellable and ineligible for most refinancing or renovations. The street started buzzing with whispered conversations and sideways glances. For someone who built her identity around HOA regulations and superiority, Karen had now become the neighborhood's cautionary tale. By the end of that week, the HOA board released a vague memo trying to spin the situation. They wrote about unfortunate property misunderstandings and proactive efforts to support member well-being. But everyone saw through it. Karen had been their attack dog for years, and now their pit bull was biting its own leash. The board was doing damage control, but their silence said more than any memo could. HOA President Frank, usually the first to rally behind Karen's complaints, was now suspiciously absent from all meetings. Rumor had it he was distancing himself to avoid legal blowback, especially since he had ignored requests to check official boundary records months earlier when this all began. I spent most of my days calmly collecting paperwork, coordinating with my lawyer, and sipping coffee on my porch like it was a front-row seat to a live sitcom. Karen, on the other hand, had become a storm with no direction. She paced her yard daily, sometimes yelling into her phone, sometimes talking to flags like they were enemy soldiers. At one point, I saw her trying to tape a "no trespassing" sign onto one of the survey markers, but the wind tore it off within minutes, leaving it flapping pitifully on her front steps. She wasn't just fighting a losing battle. She was losing it entirely in public view. Then came the turning point. My lawyer, Preston, drew up a formal buyout offer. It was generous on paper considering the circumstances, but steep enough to reflect the legal advantage we held. Karen could purchase the sliver of land under her porch for a lump sum or agree to a lease with monthly payments. In either case, she would have to sign a statement acknowledging the legal ownership of the land and drop all harassment or false claims. We hand-delivered it via a neutral courier, who returned wide-eyed and muttering, "I don't think I've ever been screamed at while standing that still." True to form, Karen didn't sign. Instead, she printed out the offer, taped it to a dartboard, and recorded herself throwing darts at it while yelling, "Over my dead body." She uploaded the video to her Facebook group, HOA Defenders United, but the responses weren't what she expected. Most of the comments mocked her. One person wrote, "You're throwing darts at a legal opportunity, genius." Another commented, "Lady, just pay the guy or move out. Nobody wants your porch that bad." The post was later deleted, but by then, the video had already been downloaded and shared around the neighborhood. Her spiral wasn't just visible, it was viral. A few days later, her home went up on the market. Sort of. She placed a crooked for sale by owner sign in her yard and listed the house online at an absurdly high price. But as soon as interested buyers requested zoning clearance or property details, they backed out. Her property now came with a legal entanglement and a pending quiet title suit, neither which looked good on a sale listing. Realtors wouldn't touch it. Lenders wouldn't approve loans. The house that once gave her social power had become a hot potato no one wanted to hold. Meanwhile, the county began quietly preparing a code enforcement review in case the structural encroachment was resolved. I didn't even have to push. The system was now working all by itself. Then something unexpected happened. Karen hosted a neighborhood open house. She dressed up, baked cookies, and put out little signs pointing to her driveway. But nobody showed up, except for two teenagers who wandered in thinking it was a yard sale and left laughing with a plastic flamingo from her garden. She stood alone on her porch, clutching a tray of cookies no one wanted, glaring across the street at me as if I were the cause of her isolation instead of the architect of her own downfall. A few days later, she tried to stage a final act of defiance. She placed a giant banner across the front of her house that read Slenland equals corrupt neighbors. But that stunt backfired too. The county arrived that afternoon and cited her for an unapproved exterior sign violation under the same HOA bylaws she once weaponized against others. That irony was almost poetic. I watched as she tore the banner down under the supervision of a code officer, the same kind of official she used to summon for minor mailbox infractions. By now, even her inner circle was vanishing. Frank had stepped down as HOA president citing health reasons, and the board was being quietly reshuffled. Neighbors who once avoided me now waved with quiet solidarity. A retired couple down the road dropped off homemade banana bread with a note that said, "Thanks for standing up to her, we've all had enough." I didn't expect to become some kind of folk hero, but I wasn't complaining. Every small act of kindness felt like a vote of confidence in the strange little war over a porch. Karen, for all her noise, had run out of options. With no buyers, no legal leverage, and no support, her only choice was to move. The court date for the title confirmation was set, and she didn't want to wait around to see the verdict. She began packing boxes late at night, quietly for once. One morning, I saw a moving truck in her driveway. She didn't wave. She didn't scream. She just stood there, watching as her porch, my porch, was loaded up with the last pieces of her fantasy. By noon, she was gone. No goodbye, no apology, just the sound of a sputtering engine and a gravel driveway emptying for good. I stood on my porch and looked across at the house that had caused so much chaos. For the first time in weeks, the air felt quiet, peaceful. The survey flags were gone. The signposts were removed, and all that remained was a house, and the truth beneath it. Soon, that truth will be written into county records, into the deed, and into the land itself. And the best part? I didn't need to yell, threaten, or retaliate. I just stood still, held my ground, and let the truth do the heavy lifting. The morning after Karen left, I walked across the property line with a quiet kind of satisfaction, the kind that doesn't need to be celebrated out loud. The survey flags were gone, but I knew exactly where they had stood. The air was finally still. No barking demands. No HOA letters shoved under my door. No threats about violations or community standards. Just the sound of birds and the occasional creak of a front porch that technically no longer belonged to her. Her house sat oddly silent now, like a stage after the play has ended. Curtains drawn, audience gone. For the first time since this all began, I had nothing left to prove and everything to reclaim. A few weeks later, the court finalized the quiet title judgment in my favor. The records were updated. The deed was revised, and the portion of land Karen's house sat on was now, without question, officially and legally mine. The judge even made a note in the ruling about Karen's repeated refusal to cooperate, which helped close the door on any future appeals. Preston called to deliver the news, and for once he sounded genuinely pleased. "Congratulations," he said. "You didn't just win the battle, you reshaped the map." I chuckled at that. In a way, it was true. The lines had shifted, physically and metaphorically. With the legal dust settled, I decided to do something unexpected. I bought the abandoned house outright through a short sale facilitated by the bank. Karen, it turned out, had defaulted on her HOA dues and mortgage simultaneously, leaving the home in financial limbo. No one else wanted to touch it, not with the trail of drama it had behind it. But for me, it was symbolic. I didn't want to live in it. I just didn't want someone like her to move back in under a different name and start the chaos all over again. The moment I signed the final purchase papers, the irony hit me square in the face. Karen had tried to kick me off my land, and now I owned hers. All of it. I had the porch repainted first, a soft gray color that matched the trim of my own house. I replaced the tacky garden gnomes she'd insisted were heritage pieces with a simple row of potted succulents. Clean, quiet, and impossible to argue with. Then, just to add a bit of flair, I installed a small brass plaque on the porch rail. It read, "Respect the line." Neighbors noticed. Some laughed. Some nodded in approval. A few even stopped by to ask if they could rent the place. I politely declined. The house wasn't for tenants. It wasn't even for guests, really. It was a monument, a trophy, and a reminder that standing your ground, literally, can sometimes change everything. But the best part came a few weeks after that. A couple of neighborhood kids started referring to the property as Karen's ghost house. They dare each other to ring the doorbell and run, telling stories about how the last woman who lived there screamed at squirrels and tried to ban lemonade stands. I didn't correct them. In fact, I added a motion sensor light that flickered every time someone approached the porch. Not to scare them, but just enough to keep the legend alive. Let it become local folklore. It deserved that much. The HOA, meanwhile, underwent a full restructuring. Frank stepped down, officially citing stress-related burnout. Though everyone knew it was more about avoiding the lawsuits Karen had threatened to drag him into, a new board was elected, made up of calmer, more reasonable people, folks who actually care about the community, and not just grass height and mailbox color. The new president, a retired teacher named Linda, paid me a visit soon after her appointment. She brought a pie and a genuine apology. "We let it get out of hand," she said. "Thank you for not burning the place down." I thanked her, accepted the pie, and told her all I wanted moving forward was peace. She smiled and said, "You've earned it." It was strange how quickly the neighborhood healed once Karen was gone. People started chatting more. Someone hosted a potluck. Kids were out riding bikes without being chased off for making too much noise. Even the guy who used to obsessively sweep his driveway every hour seemed more relaxed. It was as if a spell had been broken, and the fear that once kept everyone compliant had evaporated. And through it all, I just kept tending to my garden, one bush at a time, laughing to myself every time I passed the old property line. Eventually, I took it one step further. I turned the old house into a guest house, not for rental, but for friends and family visiting from out of town. I had it renovated just enough to be comfortable, but left one room untouched. The living room where the line had run through. I had the original survey framed and mounted there, with a plaque beneath it that read where it all went down. A few friends thought I was joking, until they heard the story. By the end of it, they were usually laughing, shaking their heads, and saying, "Only you could have pulled this off." The last piece of closure came unexpectedly. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note that said, "You won." I hope it was worth it. There was no name, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Karen. I read the note twice, then set it aside. It didn't make me angry. It didn't even make me smug. It just confirmed something I already knew. She hadn't changed. She just lost. And some people can't live with either. Now, whenever I stand on my porch and look out at the street, I see more than just quiet houses and friendly neighbors. I see boundaries, not just lines on a map, but the invisible kind too. The kind you have to defend, even when it would be easier to just let things go. The kind that matter, because if you don't stand up for them, people like Karen will trample them, smile while doing it, and call it order. But not anymore. Not here. I never wanted a war. I never set out to be a symbol of resistance or a local hero, or any of the strange titles people now half-jokingly throw my way. I just wanted to trim a bush in peace. And in the end, maybe that's what made all the difference. I didn't escalate. I enforced. I didn't scream. I proved. And when the shouting stopped, when the dust settled, and when the deed was signed, I walked away with something better than revenge. I walked away with a neighborhood that finally remembered how to breathe, and a porch that now unmistakably belonged to me.